The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Mark. So this is a story you've heard many times, which means that this is a story you haven't really heard most of the time. So we hear the gospel stories so often that they just go straight over us, they're just words. But I want you to imagine for a few minutes that somebody in a young Christian community sitting around a little table with a candle on it, about to celebrate Eucharist, and one of them who knew Jesus is telling about an event that happened while Jesus was still alive, as if you were hearing this story for the first time. And here's what it sounds like. On that day, as evening drew on, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us cross over to the other side of the lake." Leaving the crowd, they took Jesus with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. A violent squall came up, and waves were breaking over the boat so that it was filling up. Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. They woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we're drowning?" He woke up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Quiet, be still." The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you terrified? Do you not yet have faith?" They were filled with great awe and said to each other, "Who is this then, whom even the wind and the sea obey?" A gospel inspired by God. Over the last 40 years in particular, I've read a lot of psychology books and studied a lot of different psychologists, Jung and Adler and Freud and all these guys. And I can say that easily my three favorite psychologists of all time would be Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, and Jesus Christ, and William Shakespeare. I don't have any other three playwrights or avatars who seem to know more about the human condition than these three people. Not just the intrapsychic activity of an individual brain or personality, but the interpersonal dynamics and the intercommunity dynamics. No three guys ever read, can come up to snuff when it's talking about psychology. They really knew what they were. Now, I really believe that, to quote Thomas Aquinas, grace builds upon nature, which means that to be a spiritual person, you have to get your psychological stuff together. You can't be an enlightened being and be screwed up psychologically. Now, all of us have issues psychologically, and it is working through the issues that we become spiritual people. But if I'm a totally screwed up individual psychologically, that's a huge impediment to my being a spiritual person. And so grace builds upon nature, spirituality builds upon psychology. There's a psychology to spirituality, and that's what I want to treat this morning in today's homily. I'm going to talk about the psychology of spirit. And I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. The first one I'm going to call the incarnational agreement. Secondly, the incarnational equipment. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about fear and her offspring. And then fourthly, love and her babies. And then finally, I'm going to ask myself the question, is life a battle or is it a dance? So those are the 5 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, the incarnational arrangement. Now, I'm repeating stuff I've said to you many times, but it's important to start off here. I think the greatest test of a soul's commitment to growth is its willingness to incarnate. A lot of souls are very comfortable back home at source in the presence of God, and they don't want to budge. So only those souls who are committed to really growing volunteer for incarnation. And the reason is that God is fascinated by experience. But God, as a unity consciousness, cannot have experiences. And so God self-fractures into souls in order that through the souls, God can have experiences of her own. Now, the souls that stay close to God in some senses then are cheating God, because God generated us in order to have experiences that we then take back to the beehive. And so I'm totally convinced that God is a junkie. God is addicted to adrenaline rushes created by experiences that souls have. And so souls go out to generate experiences, to satisfy God's addiction. Now, the really tough souls who want to really generate extraordinary experiences, I think they sign up for planet Earth. Because planet Earth is, it's a planet and it's a dimension in which shadow and dark are almost equally balanced. And so the possibility of good and evil, are equally possible. And so people who really, really want to grow sign up for planet Earth. And when we sign up for planet Earth, God is really, really happy. Because God is he knows he's going to get a fix. Yeah. Now, in that process of incarnating, and this entire process of God wanting to have experiences, there are 6 great crises that will be encountered. And I've spoken of these a year or two ago. And the first great crisis actually is God's self-fracturing. So this unity consciousness self-fractures, breaks itself up into bite-sized pieces that we call souls in order to generate experiences. But this must be really fearful, to be a unity consciousness and then find yourself in a multiplicity of forms. This could throw even God. So that's the first crisis. God's first crisis is having the courage to self-fracture in order to generate the experiences. That's the first one. The second one is when individual souls now are clustered around God like children around their mammy, and everything is hunky-dory. And now at some stage, God says, how would you feel about incarnating so we can generate some more experiences, so you can come back with stories that we can tell around the fireside, when you come back. And the soul says, I'm dead happy here. And God says, yeah, but I need stories. And we say, really? The fire isn't good enough here? No, I need stories. And so we set off on safari. And so we launch ourselves into incarnation. That's the second great crisis. The soul itself, separating itself from God. That's the second great crisis. Coming off the launching pad, off into incarnation. The third great crisis, I believe, is the docking process. When this soul now docks with a little embryo and is trying to squeeze itself into this tiny little body. The docking process really, really is fear-inspiring. That's the third great crisis. The fourth great crisis is when this baby comes to be born and it's spelunking through a kind of a tunnel and the walls are closing in upon it. It's gotten used to this environment and is doing somersaults in the amniotic fluid, and all of a sudden the walls are closing in and there's this little tunnel that is expected to find its way through. This is really fear-inspiring for the little child inside. That's the fourth great crisis. The fifth one comes a few months later, which is the emergence of the ego. The horrible realization on the part of the little baby that it does not control this mother-child organism. So for the first few months, the baby believes totally that there's only one being here, the mother-child, and I'm in charge of it. I shout, and she arrives. I'm hungry, milk comes. I'm cold, I get cuddled. But about the age of 8 months, when the ego begins to emerge, the baby comes to the awful realization it's not a single organism, it's a train and a carriage, and the engine has now just gone away down the tracks and left me behind. And that's a horrible realization. That's the emergence of the ego. And then the sixth crisis is the dropping off of the spacesuit, what we call death. So these are the 6 great crises that God/soul sign up for in order to generate stories that we can then tell around the fireside in heaven. So that's the first. That's the arrangement, the general arrangement. That's my first point. The second point then is, what equipment do we bring to this incarnational safari? And the first thing is that we're subject to 4 huge limitations. And this is really, really difficult. And the first limitation, of course, is that we who are cosmic beings are now cramped into tiny little spacesuits. And we're trying to figure out, how does this thing work here called a hand? And what's this thing here for? So you stick everything into it to find out what the function of this is. So slowly by slowly, we're trying to figure out how this tiny little cramped spacesuit works. So that's very difficult. That's the first limitation. The second limitation is that we who had cosmic consciousness are now operating with a tiny little laptop that we carry between our ears. And the third limitation is a result of this, because our computer is so limited, we can't understand the entire gestalt of a lifetime. So we have to break it up into bite-sized pieces and process them sequentially, and that gives rise to the notion of time. Time is an illusion. It's only an artifact of this state of consciousness, but it is necessary because our computers are so limited that we can't process the entire, gestalt in one go. So we break it up into bite-sized pieces. And the fourth great limitation is that we suffer from amnesia. As soon as we're born, we begin to forget very, very quickly who we really are, where we've come from, and what our purpose is. So these are the 4 great kind of limitations of incarnation. We find ourselves then, we're developing some kind of an interface with the world. So typically psychology says that personality is an artifact, a kind of a dance between genetics and environment, between nature and nurture. So you're born with a particular set of genes that you get from your parents, and then you find yourself in a family and in a culture, and the interface between these two creates your personality. I don't agree with that. I think that there are only two of the factors, and that there's a third factor which is much more important. And that is the soul that comes in with its eternal history of many, many, many previous incarnations. All of that wisdom is encoded in the temperament of the baby. And so when the baby comes in, it already has a temperament. And if you have 2 or 3 kids, you see immediately from the moment they're born, the kids have different temperaments. Although they have the same kind of genetic material and they're in the same environment, but they've had very, very different trajectories going backwards. And so the soul's history is a huge artifact here. And my definition of personality is that personality is the interface between essence and environment. And by environment, I mean both the inner environment, the genetics, and the external environment, the family of origin, and the culture into which I was born. But the personality is the interface between the two. So if you took the same soul and put it into a different environment, a different personality would emerge because a different interface is called for. Now, in this way then, there's 3 great aspects to the resources we come in with. And the first one is our physicality. We're born into physical bodies with resources of various kinds that are suitable for life on this particular planet. And the second one is our intellectuality. We have a mind, an ability to reason, to think, to identify patterns, to make inferences, and to recognize patterns. And the third one is our emotions. Our emotions are an indication of whether or not life is good or life is not good. Now, I have all these pieces. I want to focus on emotions today for the rest of the homily. And I want to suggest that basically a little baby is born with 2 emotions. Basically, the ability to feel fear and the ability to feel love. And the fear comes from the fact that it still remembers or it experiences the 6 great crises of various kinds. The self-fracturing of God, the launching pad, the docking with the embryo, the birth process, the emergence of the ego, and the fear of death into the future. So fear comes from somehow wrestling with these 6 crises and the 4 limitations of physicality, tiny little brain, amnesia, and time. And so our fears come from the experiences of those limitations and crises and the memories of them. Love, on the other hand, comes from our memory of source, home, and our memory of mission and why we came down. So we're born with these 2 kind of competing great abilities, these 2 great emotions, fear-based ones and love-based ones. So that's where I want to proceed now with the rest of the homily. I want to examine what these look like. So point 3 then, I want to look at fear, and how fear is experienced and what's responsible for it. So my thesis is then that fear is the result of either the memory of or the experiencing of the 6 crises of the trajectory and the 4 limitations of incarnation. So all fear, I believe, is based upon those experiences and those memories. But fear itself then can have one of 3 foci. Is it foci or foci? Foci. 3 different foci. There's a past focus, there's a present focus, and there's a future focus. So when fear is focused on the past, it experiences either anger or guilt. When fear is focused on the present, it experiences either depression or self-denigration. And when fear is focused on the future, it experiences anxiety or inflexibility. So I'm going to just parse those for a few minutes now. So fear then that's focused on the past is going to experience anger against people who hurt me, or I perceive hurt me, and guilt about the stuff that I did, the mistakes I made, the bad things that I've done in my life. And so that's the focus when fear looks backwards. I'm going to be really angry at people who upset me, or who upset my family, or who upset my culture, or who invaded our country 800 years ago, whatever the story is. So it's going to be either anger against others or guilt about myself. When fear is focused on the present, it's experienced as depression. And depression very, very often is a sense of, not just that I did bad things, all of us do bad things, but that I am a bad person, or I'm useless, or I'll never amount to anything. So this is the story we begin to solve ourselves. And it leads to a kind of a self-denigration, where we reduce the self, which is a soul, an eternal being, we reduce that down to the ego. And we reduce the ego down to our shadow stuff, and then the shadow becomes our identity, our sense of self. And now we're living in a suit in which we regard ourselves as useless, and unable to do anything. So that's what happens when fear is focused on the present. When fear is focused on the future, it seems to me what it results in is an anxiety. So of the countless millions of possibilities that could emerge into the future, we focus on the ones which are the worst case scenarios. And that occupies our total mindset. And so fear focused into the future will always result in some level of anxiety. And then also in inflexibility. Inflexibility is the unwillingness or the inability to break the cycle someplace. So although the experience of fear, whether it's anxiety or depression or guilt, whatever it is, although it's a terrible experience, we're not able to, or we're not willing to break the cycle somewhere in order to kind of break into the love dynamic, which is my fourth point then. What does love look like? Love and her babies, as distinct from, fear and her offspring. What does love and her babies look like? So I'm convinced that love then is predicated upon the memory of God from whom we have just recently come, from our home, at source. So the memory of that still lingers. There's a taste of that still lingering in us. And at the same time, there's also a kind of a memory, a faint memory of why we volunteered and why we've come down and what our purpose might be. And so when we're in touch with that taste of the bardo state, or heaven, and we're able to retrieve some measure of our purpose and our reason for being here, that creates love, that creates the experience of love in our souls. And again, love has three foci as well. When love is beamed at the past, it becomes compassion and gratitude. So compassion with the understanding that all of the other people with whom I'm interacting, they're also souls on safari on planet Earth. They're also people who volunteered for incarnation. They're also people who are subject to the same crises and the same limitations. And so my heart begins to go out to them. Rather than judging people, and being angry against them, I've got compassion for them. And also compassion for myself. That I make mistakes because I'm a flawed human being, subject to these crises and these limitations. So compassion for self and for other. And then gratitude. Gratitude for the realization that, I have everything I need in order to satisfy the mission on which I am. So gratitude for the tiniest little things, because every little petal, every little flower petal, every little banana slug, every cloud in the sky, every mountain top covered with snow is a miracle. It's a gift from God to remind us of the miraculous nature of incarnation, what that can be like. So when love is focused on the past, then it leads to compassion for self and other and gratitude for everything that you experience. When love is focused on the present, then it becomes an extraordinary sense of serenity, that everything is right in the world. There is nothing wrong in the sense that we can only get to where we want to go if we start from where we are. So serenity is the ability to be where I am, and to move from that place to where I want to go. I've told you a few times about an incident that happened to me when I was in Ireland several years ago. And I was in a strange city, a city called Limerick. And I'm the world's worst navigator. I'm always getting lost. And my brother had loaned me a car. And I'm driving through Limerick City, which is a fairly big city. And I'm looking for a street called Washington Street. But I'm totally lost. So I pull over to the curb, and I wind down my window, and there's a guy passing by, and I stick my head out, and I say, "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to Washington Street?" And he kind of looks in at this long-haired kind of hippie. He's wondering, how bright can this guy be? And he says, "Well, tell you the truth now, if I was going to Washington Street, I wouldn't start from here at all. If I was going to go to Washington Street, I wouldn't start from here. Trouble is, that's where I am. I wish I'd met you someplace else. It would be easier to tell you how to get there, to Washington Street. But this is where we are." Now, serenity is that realization. You're exactly where you need to be. In order for you to get to where you want to be, you have to start where you are. So serenity is that realization. So when love is focused on the present moment, it leads to this extraordinary serenity. You're exactly where you need to be in order to go to where you want to get. And it leads also to self-esteem. Not a kind of, self-esteem is not the same as kind of narcissistic, egoic strutting. It's not that. Self-esteem is the ability to not be inflated by success or devastated by apparent failure, but the realization that your core identity is your soul. You're not your ego, You're not your shadow, you're not your body, you're not your profession, you're not your relationships, you're a soul. So your self-esteem comes from the realization of who you really are and the serenity that accompanies that. And then when you look off into the future, what does love look like into the future? And it seems to me that it looks like detachment. And detachment is not a kind of an anhedonia or apathy or whatever. That's not detachment. Detachment is not saying, okay, whatever happens is fine. That's not detachment. It's totally different. And neither is detachment the ability to do without things. That's not detachment. Detachment is the ability to do with or without things. Detachment is the ability to put my intentions for myself and for my world out there really, really strongly, like I spoke of a few weeks ago on the dissertation on prayer. It's to put my intention out with laserized focus and great, effort, but then to let God determine, the timing, the when, and the how of the realization of the intention. That's detachment. So I have intentions. I've got a vision. I've got dreams for myself and for my work, my family, my world, but I'm not bending God's hand to do it my way at my timeline. So that's what detachment looks like. And there's finally then the element of the future love is the trust. And that's why he chose this gospel this morning. So here's this great story. Jesus has been preaching on one side of the Lake of Galilee, and it's evening time, and he gets into a boat with the disciples, and there's 3 or 4 other boats, and they cross the lake. Now, the Lake of Galilee is well known for sudden, really violent squalls. So they get caught in the middle of it, and the waves are breaking over the boat. Now, it's interesting. Most of them are fishermen. And here's the carpenter asleep in the stern. Everybody else is scared, and the carpenter, who doesn't know a whole lot about boats, he's totally relaxed. And he's asleep in the stern. And they wake him up and they say to you, don't you realize we're drowning? And he stands up and he says to the waves, be still. And everything dies down. Now, there's a great Russian scientist who several years ago came up with a theory of the types of civilization that may inhabit our cosmos. And he posited that there would be 3 different types of civilizations in our cosmos. He calls them type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 civilization, he says, is a civilization which has learned how to control and utilize all of the resources of its planetary system, including the wind and the waves and the tides and the solar energies. So everything that they experience on their planet, they've learned how to control and use as a resource, but doing it in a non-degrading fashion. So he would say that's a type 1 civilization. A type 2 civilization, he believed, was a civilization who was much more advanced than that, who could do that for their entire solar system. And so imagine if Earth were a type 2 civilization, we would be controlling not just the resources of our planet, but also Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and the Sun itself. All of these would be, helping us to survive and to thrive. So that would be a type 2 civilization, according to him. And a type 3 civilization would be a civilization that had managed to control and to use the entire galaxy as a resource for themselves. And when he was asked, where do human beings fit in this scheme? He said, we're a type 0. We haven't even reached type 1. And he said, and a word of caution, the journey from type 0 to type 1 is very, very dangerous. Because when you develop the technology to control wind and weather and sun and resources, you run the risk of totally destroying yourself in some kind of a nuclear holocaust. So it's a very, very dangerous transition from type 0 to type 1. Now, as I was listening to this story years and years ago, it suddenly struck me, here's this Jesus character asleep in the boat. They're drowning, the waves are breaking over it, the wind is howling all around them, and he stands up and he says, peace, be still, and everything dies down. I get it. Oi, this guy is an ET. He's at least a type 1. He's from at least a type 1 civilization. And the proof of the pudding, he has no human father. Where did he come from? So is he a type 1 ET? Is he a type 2 ET? Is he a type 3? Or is there a type 4 ET? A civilization that controls the entire cosmos, not just a galaxy, but a cosmos. But whatever it was, he had some trick or he had some knowledge. Now, so I don't believe in miracles personally. If by miracles you mean that God temporarily sets aside the laws of the universe in order to indulge the prayers of holy people. If that's your definition of miracle, I don't believe in miracles. But I do believe that the universe is a much, much more complex place. And the laws of the universe are much, much more intricate than we know how to handle. And that if we knew the complexities of the laws of the universe, miracles happen all the time. So here's a character, Jesus, who understood at much, much deeper depth how the universe actually operates, and was able to control the elements on this little planet. It was a slam dunk. It wasn't a big deal. And so there are obviously cosmic laws that can be employed in order for us to relate very, very differently to nature itself. And what are those cosmic laws? He gave us one of them in the story. He called it faith. He said, have you no faith yet? Did you realize that you could say to the ocean, be still? And if you had faith, it would happen. Now, the problem with faith is that we have constantly misunderstood what faith means, particularly in the Christian, churches. We think faith is giving an intellectual assent to some body of, dogma that the institution comes up with, like that the Pope is infallible. That if you eat meat on a Friday, and don't go to confession immediately, and you die, you're going to go straight to hell. So we think that faith is kind of an assent to a dogmatic decree of the institution. And that is not what faith is at all. The word is being corrupted. The word that they use in Latin is credo, which means I believe, so it's an intellectual assent. The original word was cordo, I give my heart to. So it's an attitude of total trust, in the system or in God or source or whatever you want to do it. And so Christ is saying, if you really knew how the cosmos works, and if you really knew you could commit yourself totally at a heart level to that process, then you would find that miracles happen all the time. And yesterday in the small church, this was our text as well, and the first reading was from the letter to the Hebrews, in which the writer is talking about Abraham. And he says, Abraham was justified through his faith, but not faith as in a belief system, but faith as a trust. And here's the amazing story of Abraham, if you believe it. Either it's a parable, or it's symbolic, or it was an actual historical event. Abraham was from Iraq, modern-day Iraq. Then it was called Ur of the Chaldees. And at the age of 72, he has a vision in which a God called Yahweh appears to him and says, I want you to leave your home and your father's house. Now his father was a guy called Terah, and Terah was an idol maker. He used to make statuary for the gods of Babylon. He said, I want you to leave your father's house and go across the Fertile Crescent into a land I will show you, and I will give it to you as your patrimony. So at the age of 72, he heads off with his wife. Now his wife is called Sarah, and Sarah is barren. They have no kids. And at the stage that this story happens, she's 90 years of age, and Abraham is well over 100. And he has 3 visitors, angels visit. And they say to him, your wife Sarah is going to get pregnant. And she's sitting inside in the tent listening. The guys are outside, and she laughs when she hears this. And the angel says, why did your wife laugh? And she stuck her head out and said, I wasn't laughing, I had a tickle in my throat, I'll be fine. So when the baby was born, what did she call him? Isaac. And Isaac means in Hebrew, she laughed. That's what the name means. Yeah, right. And so she's told she's going to get pregnant. She's 90 years of age. She's been sterile all her life. And somehow she's going to get pregnant. Now, this didn't make any logical sense. Abram is over 100. It doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. So faith is not an intellectual agreement to it. It's something that transcends reason. It's coming from a deeper part, that somehow you can trust this ridiculous story. But it happens. She gives birth to a child. And God literally tells him, through this child of yours, I will make your offspring more numerous than the grains of sand, and all the beaches of the world are all the stars in the heavens. Now, it's an interesting fact. What do you think? If you were to count all the stars in the heavens and count all of the grains of sand and all of the beaches in the world, which is the bigger number? Stars are bigger. There are more stars in the heavens than there are. Imagine you take a bucket full of sand and you try to count the grains. And then you take a JCB, an excavator, and you get a big bucket full of it and you try to count those. And you could do that for every beach in the world. There are more stars in the heavens than there are grains of sand. And here is God saying to Abram, that's how numerous your offspring are going to be. Great. Dead happy. He believed it. And then at age 12, the kid is 12 years old, and the father is told, I want you to kill your son. Now, what kind of logic is this? You told me I was going to be the father of a great nation, more numerous than the stars of the heavens. I have one son. It's going to happen through him or it's not going to happen. And I have to kill him? Now, whether it's a true story or a symbol, whatever, the point here is that he somehow is being invited to make an act of trust which is totally against reason and logic. And so faith is not a matter of reason or logic. Faith is the total trust in the goodness of the system. And by the system, I don't mean our political system or our economic models. I mean the cosmic system, this source system. Trusting that somehow the good eventually always emerges. That this is what Jesus is calling for. And so love directed into the future then is based on this total understanding. That things always work out for the better. It may not happen in a particular lifetime, in the particular way in which you want it, but this is a safari, a single safari from God's womb to God's heart. It begins in love and it ends in love. Which brings me to my final point. So I asked myself the question then, is life a battle or is life a dance? So I believe then that I've outlined 12 kinds of virtues / vices, 12 emotions, the fear-based ones and the love-based ones, past, present and future. I believe that these 12 emotions are the core of all of the other virtues and vices and emotions that we experience. They're combinations and permutations of these other ones. Now the question is then, how does it become either a battle or a dance? When fear manages to overcome love, life becomes a battle. When love manages to melt fear, life becomes a dance. And so God throws one final virtue into the equation to make this possible for us. And it's probably the most important virtue of all, even more important than love. And it's called awareness, or sometimes called mindfulness, or sometimes called Buddha nature, or sometimes called Christ consciousness. The ability to be aware. Because even when I think I'm loving, if I'm not awake and aware, it's just mawkish sentimentality. So even love isn't real if it's not based on awareness. If it's not fully aware, it's just mawkish sentimentality. So the great final gift from God in this journey of incarnation is awareness. And very, very simply then, when life is engaged with at an unconscious level, it's a battle. And when life is engaged with at a conscious level, it is a dance.